1997, 8-year-old Landon Whitley faced a horrific car crash. A crash that should have been the end of his story. He was clinically dead 3 times. Most people don't come back from one near-death experience, but Landon defied the odds. He not only came out of the hospital alive, he met Jesus. How exactly did that happen? What did Landon see beyond the veil of life?
The Whitley family was as ordinary as they came, at least. That's how anyone in their quiet North Carolina neighborhood would have described them. Julie and Andy Whitley were the kind of parents who took pride in the simple things, like family dinners at the kitchen table, Sunday mornings at church, and long walks in the park with their son, Landon. At just 8 years old, Landon was the light of their lives. He was a bright, curious boy, with a mop of sandy blonde hair and a mischievous grin that could charm even the grumpiest of neighbors. Landon loved spending his weekends exploring the backyard, riding his bike, and playing video games with his dad. But more than anything, he adored the family's little traditions. Sunday was his favorite day of the week, not just because it meant skipping homework, but because it was family day. It always started with church, followed by a special outing or an activity they had planned together. Sometimes they would visit the local zoo, and other times it was something as simple as grabbing ice cream from the shop downtown. Landon didn't care what they did, as long as they did it together. This particular Sunday in 1997 felt like any other. The early spring air was crisp, but warming up under a clear blue sky, and Julie could hear the faint chirping of birds as she prepared breakfast in the kitchen. Pancakes, scrambled eggs, and orange juice. It was a Sunday morning staple in the Whitley household. Andy wandered in, still in his flannel pajamas, carrying the local newspaper. He said, "Big day today," while flipping through the pages. "Are we still heading out to the lake after church?" Julie smiled as she poured another round of batter onto the griddle. She said, "Yes, that's the plan. Landon has been talking about feeding the ducks all week. I think he is more excited about that than anything." From the living room, Landon's voice rang out. "And ice cream! Don't forget the ice cream!" He was sprawled out on the floor, coloring in a cartoonish version of Noah's Ark for his Sunday school homework. Andy chuckled and said, all right, ducks and ice cream. Got it." By the time breakfast was over, the Whitleys were bustling to get ready for church. Julie was helping Landon button up his plaid shirt, while Andy searched the closet for his one good pair of shoes, muttering something about them mysteriously shrinking since the last time he wore them. Despite the usual chaos of a family morning, everything felt peaceful, almost idyllic. If there was any tension or unease, it certainly didn't show. After church, Landon practically skipped to the car, his little feet moving faster than Julie's strides. The family piled into 2 vehicles, a necessity since Andy had a few errands to run before they could head to the lake. Andy led the way in his old, reliable sedan, while Julie and Landon followed closely behind in the family's station wagon. The drive was quiet, almost serene. Julie had the radio turned down low, just enough to catch the soft hum of a country song she didn't quite know the words to. Landon, seated in the back, was happily chatting about the Bible story he had learned in Sunday school that morning, something about Jonah and the whale. Julie half listened, smiling to herself as she caught bits and pieces of his enthusiastic retelling. Ahead of them, Andy's car cruised smoothly down the winding road that connected their suburban neighborhood to the highway. Julie could see him through the windshield, occasionally glancing back at her in the rearview mirror, as if to make sure they were still close behind. Landon said suddenly, "Mom, do you think ducks get bored of the same bread every day? Like, maybe they want cookies instead?" Julie laughed. "I think bread is just fine for ducks, but you can always ask them when we get there." The moment felt perfect. It was a snapshot of family life that could have been lifted from a magazine. But as they turned onto the main road leading out of town, that peace shattered in an instant. Julie noticed it first. There was a flash of movement in the corner of her eye. She turned her head just in time to see an ambulance barreling down the opposite lane, moving far too fast. Its sirens were off, and the driver seemed to be struggling to control the vehicle. Julie's heart skipped a beat as she instinctively gripped the steering wheel tighter. Ahead of her, Andy's car was still in its lane, but the ambulance was veering closer and closer. For a moment, it felt like everything slowed down. Julie's mind raced as she processed the scene unfolding in front of her. The ambulance swerved violently, crossing the center line just as it reached Andy's car. The impact was deafening. The ambulance slammed into Andy's sedan, sending it careening into the guardrail with a sickening crunch of metal. Julie barely had time to react before the ambulance swerved again, this time directly into her lane. There was no time to brake, no time to swerve. The collision was inevitable. The last thing Julie remembered was the sound of Landon screaming her name as the front of the ambulance crashed into their car. The force of the crash threw her forward, her head slamming against the steering wheel before everything went black. When Julie regained consciousness, she was surrounded by chaos. The air was filled with the sound of sirens, shouting voices, and the groan of twisted metal being pried apart. Her vision was blurry, and every part of her body ached. She tried to move, but a sharp pain in her side made her gasp. Slowly, she realized she was still in the driver's seat, pinned by the crumpled remains of the car. Panic was rising in her chest, and that's when she screamed Landon's name. She twisted her head as much as she could, searching for her son in the back seat. Her heart sank when she saw him. Landon was slumped over, his small body trapped under the collapsed frame of the car. He was not moving. Julie screamed for help. Her voice was hoarse and desperate. She screamed, "Someone, please help him." The first responders were already on the scene, working frantically to extract both Julie and Landon from the wreckage. A paramedic appeared at her window, his face calm but focused. He said, "Ma'am, we are going to get you out. Just hang on." Julie shook her head weakly and said, "My son, please, my son." The paramedic nodded, glancing toward the back seat, and said that they were working on him and asked her to just stay with him. Landon's condition was critical. He had no pulse, no signs of life. To the paramedics, it looked like the boy had already succumbed to the injuries from the crash. But they refused to give up. One medic began performing chest compressions, while another prepared the defibrillator. The sound of the machine charging filled the air, followed by the sharp crackle of electricity as they delivered the first shock. One of the medics muttered under his breath and asked Landon to stay awake, to stay with them. The ambulance ride to the hospital was a blur of frantic activity. Julie was semi-conscious and was transported in a separate vehicle. She had no idea what was happening to Landon, whether he was alive, whether he was even still in the same world as her. Her mind was clouded with fear and pain, and all she could do was pray. In the back of the ambulance, the medics continued their desperate efforts to revive Landon. After what felt like an eternity, they detected a faint heartbeat. It was fragile, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to keep going. The ambulance pulled into the emergency bay of the nearest hospital. The doors swung open as the medics rushed Landon inside. The scene in the hospital was one of controlled chaos. Doctors and nurses swarmed around Landon's stretcher, assessing his injuries and shouting orders. His body was broken in ways that words couldn't describe. There were multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and head trauma that left even the most seasoned professionals grimacing. But the most pressing issue was his heart, which had stopped again just moments after he was wheeled into the operating room. Julie was brought into the ER on a separate stretcher, her injuries severe, but not life-threatening. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind clinging to the only thought that mattered: Landon. She couldn't see him, couldn't hear the chaos unfolding in the next room, but her heart ached with a mother's instinctual fear. Inside the operating room, the doctors were in a battle against time. Landon's small, fragile body lay lifeless on the table, the heart monitor flatlining as they worked to bring him back. CPR, adrenaline injections, defibrillator shocks, they threw everything they had at him, refusing to let go. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the flatline gave way to a weak, stuttering pulse. The room erupted in a brief moment of relief, but the tension was far from over. Landon was alive, but only just. The doctors knew the road ahead would be long, uncertain, and fraught with challenges. And so began the Whitley family's worst nightmare. Landon lay at the edge of life and death, suspended between two worlds. Little did anyone know, he had already crossed that threshold, and what he had seen on the other side would soon change everything. In the operating room, the atmosphere was electric with urgency. Landon Whitley's small body lay motionless on the surgical table, wires snaking out from him to monitors that displayed a grim reality that his heart had stopped. The team of doctors and nurses moved in a synchronized chaos, their voices clipped and precise, but their expressions betrayed the stakes. A boy, just 8 years old, was slipping further from their grasp. Landon's first death was not quiet. The shrill alarm of the heart monitor flatlining pierced the air, and the lead surgeon barked, "Code Blue, start compressions." A nurse moved quickly, her gloved hands pressing against Landon's tiny chest in rhythmic pushes. The doctor prepared the defibrillator, the paddles buzzing to life with a mechanical whine. The surgeon shouted, "Clear!" The shock jolted Landon's body, his small frame lifting off the table for a moment before collapsing back down. The team stared at the monitor. Nothing. The flatline continued, mocking their efforts. Julie Whitley was just a few rooms away. She was too heavily sedated to comprehend the horrible event happening in that room. If she had been conscious, she might have felt the bond between her and her son, might have sensed his soul drifting farther away. Landon, however, was already far from that sterile hospital room. Landon later described it as an instant shift. One moment, he was surrounded by frantic voices and blinding surgical lights. The next, he was floating, weightless, and free. There was no pain, no fear, only calm. The hospital, the machines, the people, it all faded into nothingness as he found himself enveloped by a golden light. It was not harsh or blinding. It was soft and warm, like a sunrise breaking gently over a still lake. At first, he thought it was a dream. He looked down and saw himself lying on the operating table, surrounded by doctors working desperately to save him. He could see their every movement, even the beads of sweat forming on their foreheads. It was strange, watching his own body from above, detached from it all. He felt no panic, no urgency to return. Instead, a deep sense of peace washed over him, as if he were being cradled in invisible arms. As the light grew brighter, Landon noticed figures emerging from it. At first, they were indistinct, like shadows moving through a haze. But as they drew closer, their forms became clearer. These were not ordinary people. They radiated a purity and grace that was almost overwhelming. Landon instinctively knew they were angels. The angels didn't speak, not in words, at least. But Landon felt their message. They were there to guide him, to welcome him. He wanted to follow them, to go deeper into the light. But before he could take another step, he was yanked aback as if a rope had suddenly tightened around his soul. The hospital room snapped back into focus, and he was aware of the defibrillator shocking his chest, of the desperate murmurs of the medical team. The battle to save Landon was not over. His fragile heart jolted back into action for a fleeting moment, failed again. For the second time, the monitor flatlined, and the room erupted into controlled chaos. The doctor ordered, "Push another dose of epinephrine." The nurses scrambled to comply. Their faces were pale but determined. For Landon, this second departure felt different. There was no gradual transition, no floating sensation. He was simply there, standing in a place that felt infinite and timeless. The light was still present, but now it seemed more personal, more alive. It was not just surrounding him, it was part of him. And then he saw him. At first, Landon didn't recognize the figure standing a few feet away. The man looked younger than the father he knew, his face free of the weariness and wrinkles that had come with life's challenges. But there was something in his eyes, a warmth, a familiarity that made Landon's heart leap. Then he whispered, "Dad?" Landon's voice was trembling with both hope and confusion. Andy Whitley smiled, his eyes filling with tears. He said, "Hey, buddy," though not with words. The connection between them was deeper than anything spoken. It was as if their souls were communicating directly, bypassing the need for language. Landon ran to him, his small arms wrapping tightly around his father. He could feel the strength in Andy's embrace, a strength he hadn't realized he missed so much. Landon thought, "I've missed you." And he knew his father felt the same. For a moment, it was just the two of them, standing in this timeless place, reunited. Andy knelt down, placing his hands on Landon's shoulders. There was so much love in his gaze, but there was also something else, a sense of urgency. Andy said, "You can't stay here," though there was no sound. "It is not your time." Landon's heart ached at the words. He thought, "But I want to stay with you." Tears were welling in his eyes. Andy smiled again, this time with a quiet sadness. "You have to go back, Landon. Your mom needs you. There's more for you to do." Before Landon could protest, the light surrounding them shifted, and Andy began to fade. Landon reached out, trying to hold onto him, but it was no use. Andy's form dissolved into the light, and Landon felt himself being pulled away once more. Back in the operating room, the team worked tirelessly. Another shock, another dose of medication. A nurse shouted, "We've got a faint pulse," but it was weak, and everyone in the room knew how fragile it was. Landon's body could not hold on. Despite the medical team's best efforts, his heart stopped for a third time. The flatline was sharper this time, more final. The doctor hesitated, his hands hovering over Landon's chest. He asked, "Do we keep going?" His voice was heavy with doubt. For Landon, the third crossing was unlike anything he had experienced before. This time, there was no transition at all. No floating, no gradual immersion into the light. He was simply there, standing in the presence of a figure that made every fiber of his being tremble with awe. It was Jesus. Landon knew it instantly, not because of any physical markers, but because of the overwhelming love radiating from him. It was a love so pure, so complete, that it brought Landon to his knees. Jesus' eyes met his, and in that gaze, Landon felt everything, every moment of joy, every pain, every hope he had ever known. Jesus didn't speak, but his presence was a message in itself. Landon felt as though his soul were being laid bare, as though every part of him was known and loved beyond comprehension. The light surrounding Jesus was not just bright, it was alive, pulsing with energy and grace. It reached out to Landon, wrapping around him like a warm embrace. Landon wanted to stay there forever. In Jesus' presence, there was no fear, no doubt, no pain. He felt whole in a way he never had before. But deep down, he knew it was not meant to last. Jesus extended his hand, and Landon hesitated before taking it. The touch was not just physical, it was spiritual. A connection that filled Landon with both peace and purpose. He felt as though Jesus was giving him something, a piece of that light, that love, to carry back with him. Then Jesus talked to him, not in the conventional way. He did not say a word, but Landon could understand what he was trying to say to him. And then, after a few moments, he said something else. "You have to go back." The message resonated in Landon's heart, though no words were spoken. "It is not your time." Landon's soul ached at the thought. He didn't want to leave this place, this peace. But Jesus' gaze was steady, his love unwavering. Landon understood, even if he didn't want to. There was a reason he had to return. a purpose he had yet to fulfill. The light around Jesus grew brighter, almost blinding, and Landon felt himself being pulled away once more. The peace began to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of the pain and chaos of the physical world. Back in the hospital, the medical team had reached a critical decision. The doctor said, "One more time." His voice was grim. The defibrillator charged, the paddles buzzed, and with a final jolt, Landon's chest arched upward. The monitor beeped. Once, twice. A faint but steady rhythm appeared, and the room erupted into action. Landon's eyes fluttered open. The fluorescent lights above him were harsh and unwelcoming, and the beeping of machines filled his ears. His body felt heavy, battered, and broken. But his mind, his soul, carried something else, something extraordinary, something that would change everything. He was back. The first time Julie Whitley saw Landon open his eyes, it was as if the world had tilted back into place. She had been sitting by his hospital bed, her hands clutched tightly together in silent prayer. The beeping monitors, the rhythmic hum of the machines, and the sterile smell of antiseptics had become her new normal. But the sight of her son's eyelids fluttering, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths, was like a miracle she didn't think she would see. At first, Landon didn't seem fully aware of his surroundings. His gaze drifted around the room, unfocused and heavy with exhaustion. Julie leaned forward, her heart pounding, wanting to reach out and pull him into her arms, but terrified of hurting him. His body was still frail, covered in bandages and bruises, his small frame dwarfed by the hospital bed and the maze of wires connected to him. The nurses had warned her. They had explained that Landon's recovery would be slow, that his injuries were severe and his body was weak. But no amount of preparation could stop the flood of emotions that came with seeing her son alive. Relief, gratitude, and fear, they all collided in her chest, leaving her breathless. She whispered words of reassurance, promises that he was safe now, that everything would be okay. But Landon barely reacted. He was conscious, yes, but distant, as if part of him was still somewhere else. As Landon became more alert in the following days, the reality of his injuries set in. Every movement sent a jolt of pain through his body, a constant reminder of the trauma he had endured. His arms and legs were wrapped in casts, his ribs tightly bandaged to protect the fractures. Even breathing felt like a chore. Julie watched helplessly as he winced with every adjustment, his small hands gripping the edges of the bed in silent agony. Landon didn't complain. He never asked why it had happened or expressed anger at his situation. But the weight of his silence was heavy. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze often fixed on the ceiling or drifting to the window, where he could see the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. Julie tried to distract him with stories, toys, and his favorite books, but nothing seemed to draw him out of his shell. About a week into Landon's recovery, Julie faced one of the hardest moments of her life. She knew she couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. Landon had to know about his father. The doctors had suggested waiting until he was stronger, but Julie couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to hear it from her, that he deserved the truth. She approached him gently, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. She told him that Andy hadn't survived the accident, that he had been taken from them that day. Julie braced herself for Landon's reaction, expecting tears, confusion, and maybe even anger. But what she got instead was silence. Landon didn't cry. He didn't ask questions or show any outward emotion. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and turned his head toward the window. Julie felt her heart break all over again. She couldn't tell if he was in shock, if he was holding back his feelings, or if he was just too tired to process the news. What she didn't know was that Landon already knew. He had seen his father, felt his love, and he couldn't bring himself to share that part of his experience. Not yet. Over the next 2 months, Landon's recovery was slow, but steady. He was eventually discharged from the hospital and brought home, though he was still bedridden. The Whitley home, once filled with laughter and activity, had become quieter. Julie had converted the living room into a makeshift bedroom for Landon, setting up his bed near the window so he could see outside. His days were spent in a haze of medication, physical therapy, and moments of restless contemplation. He rarely spoke, except to answer Julie's questions with short, polite responses. Even when he was in pain, he never complained. Instead, he seemed to retreat into himself, lost in thought. He would stare out the window for hours, watching the world go by, as if he were searching for something or someone. Julie noticed the change immediately. Landon had always been an energetic, curious child, full of questions about the world and stories to share. But now, he was quieter, more reserved. He seemed older, as if the accident had aged him in ways she couldn't understand. She told herself it was just the trauma, that he needed time to heal emotionally as well as physically. But as the weeks passed, her worry grew. Julie tried everything to bring back the light in her son's eyes. She surrounded him with things he loved, his favorite books, toys, and even his pet hamster, which she placed near his bed to keep him company. She read to him every night, choosing his favorite Bible stories, and pausing to ask if he had any questions. But Landon rarely responded. He would listen, his expression thoughtful, but his mind always seemed somewhere else. Her concern turned to fear as she noticed how much time he spent in silence. He didn't seem depressed, exactly. He was polite, cooperative during his therapy sessions, and even smiled faintly when his grandmother visited. But there was a distance between them now, a barrier she couldn't seem to break through. Julie began to wonder if Landon was hiding something. She didn't want to push him, knowing he had already been through so much. But the more she watched him, the more she felt like there was something he was not telling her. Something important. One evening, Julie was in the kitchen, washing dishes while keeping an ear out for Landon. She had left him propped up in bed with a tray of dinner, but he hadn't touched it. She dried her hands and walked into the living room to check on him, only to find him staring at the window again, his food untouched. "Landon," she said softly, sitting down beside him, "you have barely eaten. Are you feeling okay?" He nodded, but didn't look at her. Julie placed a hand on his, her heart aching at the sight of him. She wanted so badly to help him, to understand what he was going through, but she didn't know how. She began carefully. "Sweetheart, if there is something on your mind, you can tell me." Landon didn't respond. Julie waited for a moment, then sighed and kissed his forehead. "I'm here when you are ready," she whispered before standing to leave. It was a quiet night, the kind where every sound in the house seemed amplified. Julie had just settled into bed when she heard the faint sound of Landon's voice calling her name. She sat up immediately, her heart pounding as she hurried to the living room. Landon was sitting up in bed, his hands folded in his lap. His face was calm, but his eyes held an intensity that made Julie pause. He told her he was ready to talk, that he wanted to tell her everything. Julie felt a mix of relief and trepidation. She sat down beside him, holding his hand as she braced herself for whatever he was about to share. She could see that this was hard for him, that whatever he was carrying had been weighing on him for weeks. But she also knew that this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when her son would finally let her in. Landon sat on his bed, his small hands folded tightly in his lap. His face, still pale from the accident, looked calm, yet filled with an intensity that Julie hadn't seen in her son before. She could tell that whatever he was about to say was not easy for him, but there was also a sense of resolve, as if he had been carrying this weight for weeks and was finally ready to set it down. As Julie perched on the edge of his bed, holding his hand, Landon took a deep breath and began to speak. He started by telling her about what had happened after the accident, how he had felt himself leave his body and drift into a place filled with light. He said he had seen the hospital, the doctors working on him, and even her sitting in another room. But then, everything changed. The light became brighter and warmer, and he felt himself being pulled towards something he couldn't explain, but knew was extraordinary. Landon's voice trembled as he told Julie about the moment he saw his father. At first, he didn't recognize him. The man standing in the radiant light looked younger and healthier than the father he remembered. There were no lines of worry on his face, no trace of the stress that had weighed him down in life. But when their eyes met, Landon felt it in his heart. He knew it was his dad. His father smiled at him, the kind of smile that made Landon feel safe and loved, just like he had always felt when Andy was around. There was no pain in his father's eyes, no sadness, only peace and joy. Landon described running toward him, his small legs moving faster than they ever had. He wrapped his arms around his dad, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Julie's breath caught as she listened, her own emotions swirling. She could not imagine how it must have felt for Landon to see his father again, in a place so far removed from the chaos and pain of the accident. And yet, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow, knowing that she hadn't been there, that she hadn't been able to share in that moment. Landon told her that his father knelt down and placed his hands on his shoulders. He didn't speak, but somehow Landon understood everything he wanted to say. His father conveyed a deep love, a love that transcended words and filled Landon's heart with a warmth he had never known. But there was also a sense of urgency, a message that it was not time for Landon to stay. Andy told him in that silent, soulful way that Julie needed him, that his work was not done. Landon said he felt torn. He wanted to stay in that place of peace, to be with his father where there was no pain or fear. But his father reassured him, promising that they would see each other again someday, and that when that day came, it would be even more beautiful than this moment. As Landon described the encounter, Julie felt tears streaming down her face. She realized then why Landon hadn't cried or reacted when she told him about Andy's death. He already knew. He had already said goodbye in a way she couldn't comprehend. And yet, she felt a strange sense of comfort knowing that Andy had been there for their son, guiding him and helping him find his way back. Landon hesitated as he moved on to the next part of his story. He looked at Julie, his eyes filled with a mix of awe and reverence. He said that after his father faded into the light, he felt another presence, one even more overwhelming. It wasn't just light, it was everything. It was love, peace, and understanding all rolled into one. Landon said he didn't need to see or hear anything to know who it was. He just knew. It was Jesus. He described Jesus as being unlike anyone he had ever met, yet completely familiar. His presence wasn't intimidating or overwhelming in a scary way. It was comforting, like being wrapped in the softest, warmest blanket. Landon said he felt as though every part of him was known, every thought, every fear, every hope, and despite all of that, there was no judgment, only love. Landon told Julie that Jesus communicated with him in the same way his father had, not with words, but with feelings and understanding. He said he felt a sense of purpose being poured into him, as if Jesus was reminding him of something he had always known deep down, but had forgotten. He said Jesus showed him glimpses of life, his life, Julie's life, and the lives of others. He saw moments of joy and pain, of love and loss, and he understood that every moment, no matter how small, mattered in the grand design. Landon shared that Jesus imparted truths to him, truths that felt simple yet profound. He said Jesus showed him that love was the most powerful force in existence, more powerful than hate, fear, or even death. Love, Jesus revealed, was not just an emotion, it was the very fabric of existence. It was what held everything together, what made life worth living. He said Jesus emphasized the importance of kindness and compassion, especially in a world that seems so often filled with anger and division. Landon described how Jesus showed him people, strangers, friends, and even enemies, and how their lives could be transformed by even the smallest act of kindness. He said Jesus made him feel the ripple effects of love, how one act could lead to another, creating a chain reaction that reaches farther than anyone could imagine. Landon also said Jesus reminded him of the importance of faith, not just faith in God, but faith in people, in the goodness of the world. He said Jesus knew that life was not easy, that it was full of challenges and heartbreak, but that every struggle had a purpose. Landon said he felt as though Jesus was encouraging him to hold on to hope, even in the darkest moments, because those moments often led to the brightest revelations. Julie listened intently as Landon explained why he hadn't shared any of this sooner. He said that when he woke up in the hospital and heard her tell him about Andy's death, he didn't feel the need to react. He already knew that his father was gone, but he also knew where his father was, and that knowledge brought him peace. He didn't cry because he didn't feel the same sense of loss. He felt his father's love all around him, and he knew Andy was safe and happy. But more than that, Landon said he had been scared to share what he had experienced. He was not sure how to put it into words, or if anyone would even believe him. He said the memories felt too big, too sacred to explain, and so he had kept them to himself, trying to make sense of them in his own way. As Landon spoke, Julie could see the weight lifting from his shoulders. He told her that the experience had changed him and made him see the world differently. He said he felt both older and younger at the same time, as if he had been given a glimpse of something eternal, but was still just a boy trying to figure it all out. He said he felt a sense of responsibility now, a need to live up to what he had been shown. He wanted to be kinder, more patient, more loving. But he also admitted that it was hard. Coming back to the world after being in such a perfect, peaceful place was overwhelming. He said he sometimes felt like he didn't belong, like part of him was still in the light. As Julie listened to her son, she felt a mix of emotions. She was overwhelmed by the depth of his experience, by the wisdom and love he had been shown. But she was also struck by how much he had carried on his own, how much he had struggled to process without her. When Landon finished, Julie wrapped her arms around him, holding him close as if she could shield him from the enormity of what he had experienced. She told him that she believed him, that she was proud of him, and that she would always be there to help him carry this weight. For the first time in weeks, Landon smiled. There was a real, genuine smile on his face. He said he felt lighter now, as if sharing his story had freed him from the burden of silence. And as Julie looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen since the accident. It was peace. The days following Landon's revelation were a whirlwind of emotions for Julie Whitley. She couldn't stop thinking about what her son had told her, the visions, the love he had experienced, and the profound teachings he had brought back. Every detail stayed with her, echoing in her mind like a divine melody. It was not just a story, it was a message, one she felt was not meant to be kept within the walls of their home. Julie prayed about it endlessly, asking for guidance. Should she share what Landon had experienced? Would anyone believe them? Was this something the world even needed to hear? But as she looked at her son, now healing both physically and emotionally, she realized the answer was clear. Landon had been given this experience for a reason. It was not just for him or for her. It was for everyone. Landon, too, felt a growing sense of purpose. He told Julie he wanted to share his story, that it felt like part of the mission Jesus had given him. At first, Julie hesitated. She was fiercely protective of her son and worried about how people might react. Would they dismiss him? Mock him? But Landon was calm and resolute. He said it was not about what people thought. It was about doing what was right. After much prayer and conversation, they made the decision together. They would start with their church. It was a safe place, surrounded by people they trusted, and Julie felt it was the best way to honor the sacredness of Landon's experience. The following Saturday evening, Julie and Landon walked into the church office to speak with Pastor Richards, a kind, silver-haired man who had been a steady presence in their lives for years. Pastor Richards had visited them often during Landon's recovery, offering prayers and comfort, but he didn't yet know the full extent of what had happened. Julie explained to him that Landon had something to share, something important. Pastor Richards listened patiently, his hands folded on his desk, as Landon recounted his experience. He spoke about meeting his father, the presence of Jesus, and the teachings he had been given. His voice was steady, though his small hands fidgeted nervously in his lap. Pastor Richards didn't interrupt. He leaned forward, his expression a mix of curiosity and reverence. When Landon finished, the pastor sat back in his chair, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He finally spoke with his soft voice and said, "This is remarkable. It is not every day you hear something like this, but it is clear to me that this story is not just for you. It is for all of us." Julie felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been so nervous about how Pastor Richards might react, but his response was full of kindness and faith. He suggested that Landon share his story with the congregation the next day during the Sunday service. He believed it would inspire others, strengthen their faith, and remind them of the power of love and hope. The next morning, Julie woke up feeling both anxious and hopeful. She helped Landon get ready, dressing him in his best shirt and combing his hair just the way he liked it. She could see he was nervous, but there was also a quiet determination in his eyes. As they arrived at the church, the familiar hum of voices and organ music greeted them. Julie took a deep breath as they walked down the aisle to their usual pew, her heart pounding with anticipation. Pastor Richards had already spoken to a few members of the congregation, hinting that something special was planned for the service. The church was full, as it usually was on Sunday mornings. Families with children, elderly couples, and young adults filled the pews, their voices joining in the hymns with heartfelt enthusiasm. Julie couldn't help but notice the sense of peace that seemed to settle over the room, as if the very walls were preparing to witness something extraordinary. After the sermon, Pastor Richard stood at the pulpit and addressed the congregation. He spoke briefly about the power of faith and the mysterious ways in which God reveals himself. Then he introduced Landon. Landon walked to the front of the church, his small frame dwarfed by the massive pulpit. Julie held her breath, praying silently for strength for her son. The room grew quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy with expectation. Landon began to speak. His voice was soft at first, but as he continued, it grew steadier, more confident. He described the accident, how he had felt himself leave his body, and the incredible journey he had taken. He spoke about meeting his father, the love he had felt, and the teachings Jesus had shared with him. He told them about the importance of love and how it was the foundation of everything, more powerful than any force on earth. He spoke about kindness, compassion, and the ripple effect of good deeds. He described the peace he had felt in Jesus' presence and the sense of purpose he had been given. The congregation was captivated. Some people wept openly, their tears glistening in the soft light streaming through the stained glass windows. Others sat in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of awe and wonder. Julie could see the impact Landon's words were having, how they were touching hearts and opening minds. When Landon finished speaking, the room erupted into applause, not the polite kind, but a heartfelt, thunderous response that seemed to shake the very walls of the church. Julie felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her son, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. After the service, people flocked to them, eager to share their thoughts and feelings. Some spoke about how Landon's story had reignited their faith, giving them a renewed sense of hope. Others shared their own experiences of loss and grief, finding comfort in Landon's vision of heaven and the love that awaited them. One elderly woman told Julie that she had been questioning her faith for years. She said Landon's words had reminded her of the power of love and the promise of heaven, giving her a peace she hadn't felt in decades. But not everyone was convinced. A few people approached Julie with skepticism, asking pointed questions and expressing doubt. Was it possible that Landon's experience was just a dream or a hallucination? Could it have been the result of his injuries and the trauma of the accident? Julie listened patiently, understanding their doubts, but holding firm in her belief. Word of Landon's story began to spread. Members of the congregation shared it with friends and family, who in turn shared it with others. Soon, people from neighboring churches and even different towns began reaching out, wanting to hear Landon speak. Julie and Landon were invited to small gatherings, prayer groups, and community events. Each time, Landon would share his story with the same quiet sincerity, his words touching the hearts of everyone who listened. Julie marveled at his resilience, at how he carried the weight of his experience with such grace. At one gathering, a young man approached Landon with tears in his eyes. He said he had been struggling with anger and bitterness for years, unable to forgive someone who had hurt him deeply. But after hearing Landon's story, he felt a shift in his heart. He said he was ready to let go of his anger and embrace the love and forgiveness Landon had spoken about. These moments reinforced Julie's belief that they were doing the right thing. She saw how Landon's story was changing lives, how it was bringing people closer to each other and to God. And while the journey was not always easy, there were still skeptics and challenges to face. Julie felt a deep sense of peace knowing they were following the path they were meant to take. The Whitleys' lives changed dramatically after Landon shared his story at church that Sunday. What began as a small, intimate recounting of a deeply personal experience quickly grew into something much bigger. The story spread like wildfire, touching hearts, sparking debates, and drawing people from all walks of life. For Julie and Landon, it was a whirlwind of emotions. She felt gratitude, awe, and, at times, overwhelming responsibility. Within days of Landon's testimony at church, word began to spread throughout their small North Carolina community. Friends of friends, distant relatives, and even strangers reached out, wanting to know more about what Landon had seen and experienced. Julie was inundated with phone calls and visits, people asking for details, for comfort, or simply to hear the story again in Landon's own words. At first, Julie tried to keep things manageable, limiting the number of visitors and encouraging people to listen to the sermon recording instead. But as more people heard about Landon's story, the requests became harder to contain. Members of neighboring churches began inviting the Whitleys to share their testimony at their services. Prayer groups and community gatherings turned into packed events, with people driving for hours just to hear Landon speak. Many of the people who came to hear Landon's story were searching for something: hope, reassurance, or answers to questions they hadn't dared to voice before. Julie remembered one particular woman, a mother in her late 30s who had lost her teenage son in a tragic accident. She sat quietly during one of Landon's talks, her face pale and her hands trembling. Afterward, she approached Julie and Landon, her voice breaking as she thanked them. She shared that she had been consumed by grief, unable to believe that her son was truly at peace. But hearing Landon describe heaven, the light, the love, and the absence of pain, gave her a sense of comfort she hadn't felt since her son's passing. She told them that Landon's words had given her the courage to start living again, to believe that her son was in a better place. These encounters became a regular part of their lives. People shared stories of loss, of near-death experiences, and even of mysterious events they couldn't explain. Some described seeing loved ones in dreams or feeling their presence during difficult times. Others spoke of moments when they felt inexplicably guided or protected. as if by unseen hands. These stories, though deeply personal, echoed Landon's experience, reinforcing the idea that the world was far more connected and mysterious than it seemed. It was not long before the media took notice. A local newspaper ran a story about Landon's experience, focusing on the accident and his miraculous recovery. The article was shared widely, eventually catching the attention of regional news stations. Soon, reporters were knocking on the Whitleys' door, asking for interviews. Julie was hesitant at first. She worried about exposing Landon to too much attention, about the possibility of people misinterpreting or distorting his story. But Landon reassured her. He said he felt ready, that sharing his experience was part of the mission he had been given. And so, they began speaking to the press. The first TV interview was nerve-wracking. Sitting under bright studio lights, surrounded by cameras and microphones, Julie felt out of her depth. But Landon was calm and composed, answering questions with the same quiet sincerity he had shown in church. He spoke about his father, about the love he had felt in heaven, and about the lessons Jesus had shared with him. The anchor was visibly moved, her voice trembling as she thanked Landon for sharing his story. The segment aired the following evening, and the response was immediate. Emails, phone calls, and letters flooded in, many from people who had been touched by Landon's words. Some shared their own stories of faith and loss. Others simply expressed gratitude for the hope his story had given them. Of course, not everyone was convinced. As Landon's story gained more attention, skeptics began to voice their doubts. Some argued that his experience was likely the result of brain trauma or the effects of anesthesia. They cited scientific studies on near-death experiences, which suggested that such visions could be caused by the brain's response to extreme stress or lack of oxygen. One skeptic was a professor of neuroscience. He appeared on a radio show where Julie and Landon were being interviewed. He explained that near-death experiences often involved vivid hallucinations brought on by the brain's attempt to process the trauma of dying. He argued that Landon's vision of heaven was likely influenced by his upbringing in a Christian household, where concepts of Jesus and angels were already familiar to him. Julie listened politely, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. When it was her turn to speak, she acknowledged that there were things science couldn't yet explain. She said she didn't expect everyone to believe their story, but she also couldn't ignore the details Landon had shared, details he couldn't have known or imagined at his age. She spoke about the peace and love Landon had brought back with him, and how it had changed not just their family, but countless others who had heard his testimony. Landon, too, responded calmly. He said he understood why some people might doubt his experience, but he couldn't deny what he had seen and felt. He told the professor that the love he had experienced in heaven was not something he could have imagined. It was too vast, too real. And while he didn't have all the answers, he knew in his heart that what he had experienced was true. One of the most compelling arguments in favor of Landon's story came from the details he shared that couldn't be easily explained. For example, he described seeing his father as a younger man, with features that matched an old photograph Julie had never shown him. He also recounted conversations and events that had occurred while he was unconscious, things he couldn't have known unless he had somehow been there. Another powerful counterpoint came from the impact Landon's story had on others. Time and again, people shared how his words had brought them comfort, helped them heal, or restored their faith. Julie believed that the fruit of Landon's testimony, the love, hope, and transformation it inspired, was evidence of its truth. Even if skeptics dismissed it as a coincidence or a hallucination, the lives it touched were undeniable. As the months went on, the invitations continued to pour in. Churches, community centers, and even schools reached out, asking Landon to speak. Julie had to start keeping a detailed calendar just to keep track of their schedule. They traveled across the state and eventually to other parts of the country, sharing Landon's story with anyone who wanted to hear it. At one event, a young girl approached Landon after his talk. She was shy, clutching a small stuffed bear as she stood in line to speak with him. When it was her turn, she looked up at him with wide eyes and said that her brother had passed away the year before. She asked if he thought her brother was in heaven. Landon knelt down to her level and told her that heaven was a place filled with love, where no one felt pain or sadness. He said he believed her brother was happy and safe, surrounded by that love. The girl smiled through her tears and hugged him tightly, her mother standing behind her with a look of gratitude that Julie would never forget. As Landon's story spread, they began to hear from others who had experienced similar things. A man in his 50s shared how he had survived a massive heart attack and seen a bright light during his brief time unconscious. A young woman described a vision she had had after a car accident, where she felt the presence of her deceased grandmother guiding her back to life. These stories, while different in detail, shared common themes: love, light, and a sense of purpose. Julie found comfort in hearing them, knowing that Landon's experience was not unique. It was part of a larger, mysterious tapestry that connected people across time and space. Despite the growing attention, Julie worked hard to ensure that Landon's life remained as normal as possible. She limited their travel to weekends and school holidays, allowing Landon to focus on his education and friendships. She also made sure he had time to just be a kid, to ride his bike, play video games, and spend time with his friends. But even in those quiet moments, Landon's sense of purpose never wavered. He continued to speak with the same sincerity and humility, never letting the attention go to his head. Julie often marveled at his resilience, at how he carried the weight of his experience with such grace. As Landon's story gained more national attention, the skepticism grew louder. Some critics accused Julie of exploiting her son for attention or financial gain. Others suggested that Landon's story had been embellished over time, shaped by the retellings and the reactions of others. Julie felt the sting of these accusations deeply. She had always been careful to protect Landon, to ensure that he was not overwhelmed or pressured. She knew in her heart that their intentions were pure, but it was hard not to feel hurt by the doubts and criticisms. Landon, however, remained unfazed. He told his mother that it didn't matter what people said about them. He knew the truth of what he had experienced, and he believed that the people who needed to hear his story would find it, no matter what. As the years went on, the Whitleys continued to share their story, balancing their mission with the demands of everyday life. They spoke at events, connected with people from all walks of life, and offered comfort and hope to those who needed it most. For Julie, the journey was both exhausting and rewarding. She had lost her husband, but she had also gained a profound sense of purpose. Landon's experience had changed not just their family, but countless others as well. And while the skeptics might never be convinced, Julie knew in her heart that they were doing the right thing. For Landon, the journey was just beginning. He had been given a glimpse of something extraordinary, a gift that came with a responsibility to share it. And while the path was not always easy, he walked it with courage, knowing that he was fulfilling the purpose he had been given. By now, you might have already sensed that not everyone believes in near-death experiences. And that's fair. After all, the idea of going into another realm, meeting loved ones who have passed, or even standing face-to-face with a divine figure can feel far-fetched to those who have not experienced it firsthand. Skeptics might dismiss such stories as vivid dreams, hallucinations, or simply the brain's response to trauma. Even Landon's own story, no matter how heartfelt and detailed, has not convinced everyone. But the thing is, whether you believe it or not, these experiences force us to ask questions that go beyond science and logic. Why do so many people from different backgrounds and cultures describe similar sensations when they brush against death? Is it all just the brain firing its last signals? Or could there be something more? Something we cannot quite measure or explain? Landon's story is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. It is not the only account of its kind, and it certainly isn't the first. People across the world and throughout history have shared tales of what they have seen, felt, and learned when they have come close to the end of life. These stories, whether rooted in religion, spirituality, or simple human emotion, all seem to touch on something universal, a sense of love, connection, and purpose that transcends the physical world. So before we dismiss it all as fantasy or coincidence, let's take a closer look. Let's explore what happens during these moments when life and death seem to intersect. Let's see how different cultures and traditions have tried to make sense of these phenomena. And let's ask ourselves, what if? What if there is more to these stories than we realize? What if they hold lessons that could change the way we see life, death, and everything in between? You see, near-death experiences have captivated human imagination for centuries, sparking debates among scientists, theologians, and philosophers. These moments, often described as journeys beyond life, are characterized by profound sensations, a feeling of leaving one's body, entering a tunnel of light, encountering spiritual beings, and even glimpsing another realm. For those who have experienced them, near-death experiences are transformative, often altering their perspective on life, death, and everything in between. The most intriguing part here is what happens during a near-death experience. From a medical standpoint, near-death experiences typically occur during moments of extreme trauma, like cardiac arrest, accidents, or surgeries. During these episodes, the brain may be deprived of oxygen, the heart stops, and consciousness fades. Yet, many such survivors report vivid, detailed recollections of their experiences, often claiming to have seen things they couldn't possibly have witnessed in their physical state. One of the most common features of near-death experiences is the sensation of leaving the body. People describe floating above their physical form, watching doctors and nurses working frantically to save them. They recall conversations, specific movements, and even seeing loved ones in other rooms, accounts that are often verified by witnesses afterwards. The next stage is often described as entering a tunnel, where they are greeted by an overwhelming light. This light, they say, is not harsh or blinding, but warm and inviting, radiating love and peace. Many report encountering beings of light, angels, or deceased loved ones who guide them or deliver messages. These moments are often accompanied by a sense of profound understanding, as if the mysteries of life are suddenly laid bare. Science has attempted to explain near-death experiences through the lens of biology and neurology. Some researchers suggest that these experiences are the result of the brain's reaction to extreme stress. When the body is in crisis, the brain releases a flood of chemicals, including endorphins and DMT, which could create vivid hallucinations. Other theories propose that near-death experiences are linked to hypoxia and lack of oxygen to the brain, which might explain the sensations of light and detachment. The temporal lobe, a region of the brain associated with memory and emotion, is also believed to play a role, with some studies suggesting that electrical activity in this area during trauma could produce the sensations reported during near-death experiences. But there is a catch. None of these theories fully explain the phenomenon. How can someone accurately describe events that happened in another room while they were unconscious? How do people return with knowledge or insights they couldn't have known before? Science acknowledges the physical processes of the brain, but struggles to account for the spiritual, emotional, and deeply personal aspects of near-death experiences. The idea of glimpsing another realm isn't unique to modern accounts or Western traditions. Cultures and religions across the globe have their own tales of near-death experiences or journeys to the afterlife, often shaped by their spiritual beliefs and practices. In Hindu tradition, near-death experiences often involve the concept of Yama, the god of death. Many people who have experienced near-death experiences in Hindu cultures describe being taken by Yama's messengers to the celestial courts. There, they are told their time hasn't come yet and are sent back to their bodies. These experiences are often framed within the context of karma and the soul's journey, reinforcing the belief in reincarnation. The ancient Egyptians believed in a journey to the afterlife, guided by the god Anubis. The deceased's heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth. While there are no documented near-death experiences from that time, The vivid descriptions of the soul's journey bear striking similarities to modern accounts of tunnels, light, and divine encounters. Indigenous tribes across the world have long embraced the idea of crossing into another realm during near-death experiences. For example, some Native American tribes speak of the spirit walk, where individuals who are close to death travel to the spirit world. There, they encounter ancestors or spirit guides who determine whether they return to life or continue their journey. In Buddhism, near-death experiences are sometimes interpreted as glimpses of the bardo, the transitional state between death and rebirth. Tibetan Buddhism, in particular, describes visions of peaceful and wrathful deities that a soul might encounter during this state, aligning closely with the vivid and otherworldly experiences reported by near-death experience survivors. If we talk about Landon's near-death experience, it was not just a glimpse into another world. It came with profound teachings that could serve as a guide for life. These lessons, simple yet profound, resonate deeply when viewed through the lens of love, compassion, and faith. Landon described feeling an overwhelming sense of love during his time in the light, a love that was unconditional and all-encompassing. It was not just something he felt, it was the essence of everything around him. This aligns with what many spiritual traditions teach, that love is the highest virtue, the foundation of existence. Applying this lesson in life means striving to love unconditionally, not just family and friends, but even those who are difficult to love. It is about showing kindness, forgiveness, and empathy, even in challenging situations. By choosing love over anger or resentment, we create ripples that can transform not only our lives, but the lives of those around us. One of the most significant messages Landon received was that his life had a purpose. He was told it was not his time to stay in heaven because he had work to do on earth. This idea that each life is part of a greater plan is both empowering and humbling. For Landon, this purpose was sharing his story and spreading the message of love and faith. For others, it might mean using their talents to help others, building meaningful relationships, or simply being a source of light in a dark world. The key is to recognize that every moment, no matter how small, contributes to a greater whole. Landon also spoke about how Jesus emphasized the importance of kindness and compassion. He was shown how even the smallest acts of kindness, smiling at a stranger, helping a neighbor, or comforting a friend, could create a chain reaction of positivity. This lesson is a reminder that we all have the power to make a difference, no matter how insignificant our actions might seem. By choosing kindness, we not only improve the lives of others, but also enrich our own. During his time in heaven, Landon felt a profound sense of peace, a reassurance that everything was as it should be. This peace came from faith in something greater than himself, in a love that transcended all earthly struggles. For those grappling with doubt or despair, this lesson is a call to hold on to hope, even in the darkest moments. Faith doesn't have to be tied to a specific religion or belief system. It is about trusting that there is meaning in life, even when it is hard to see. These teachings, though rooted in Landon's extraordinary experience, are deeply practical. They remind us of the values that make life meaningful and the choices that define our character. Julie remembered a woman who came to hear Landon speak, a mother who had lost her son in a violent crime. She shared that she had been consumed by anger and hatred toward the person responsible. But after hearing Landon's story, she began to see things differently. She realized that holding on to her anger was only hurting her further. Inspired by Landon's message of love and compassion, she decided to forgive, not for the other person's sake, but for her own healing. At another event, a man approached Julie with tears in his eyes. He had been diagnosed with a terminal illness and had been struggling with fear and despair. But hearing Landon describe heaven as a place of peace and love gave him comfort. He said he was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. Instead, he felt a sense of hope and gratitude for the time he had left. While Landon's story brought comfort to many, it also raised questions that even he couldn't answer. Why do some people have near-death experiences while others don't? What determines who gets a glimpse of the afterlife and who doesn't? These mysteries remind us that life is full of unknowns and that some questions may never be answered. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the beauty of life lies in its mysteries, in the faith it takes to embrace the unknown and trust in a greater plan. As Julie reflected on Landon's journey, she realized that his story was not just about his near-death experience. It was about the lessons he brought back, the lives he touched, and the love he inspired. It was a story that transcended science, religion, and skepticism. A story about what it means to be human. Whether or not people believed in Landon's vision of heaven, they couldn't deny the impact his story had on others. It was a reminder that even in the face of uncertainty, we can choose love, kindness, and hope. And in doing so, we can create a little bit of heaven here on earth. So what do you think happens during a near-death experience? Is it just the brain playing tricks? A final burst of imagination as it shuts down? Or could it be something more? Something beyond what science can explain? Drop your opinions in the comments below. And while you are here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We have more stories, mysteries, and thought-provoking content coming your way. Thanks for watching.